Well, how are you today? Whether it's morning, evening, or afternoon, we're glad you're with us, and join us today for half an hour on Book of Revelation. We are GPS, if you haven't figured that out, God's prophetic surprise. Dr. Jon from Loma School of Religion down the street from us here in LLBN, and Pastor Sara Colon, who is our youth pastor at Garden Grove, on her way to Brazil.
Woot, woot.
In between our taping times, we talk Brazil talk, as she's leaving in 2 days. So you know my Brazil story. I read about someone who was, you're going on the Amazon, you're going to be on a boat on the Amazon. So they were on this boat, and the cook was cooking, and he would every morning get up with he would take the match to light his stove. He would scratch it on the post in the kitchen in the boat. One morning, he went to scratch it, the match, and it wouldn't light. Got another one.
Please tell me it's a snake.
100-foot anaconda wrapped around the post. I just want to plant that thought in your mind as you go to Brazil.
Don't bother me. I love snakes.
100-foot anaconda on the boat with 30 of your kids on there?
It would probably be jarring, and I would have to figure out how to make sure everyone gets off the boat alive, but not inherently.
What about Zika? You're taking all these young girls to Zika virus. What about that?
Nobody is pregnant, at least not that I know of, so I think we're okay.
So as long as you're not pregnant, when you are there, it's okay?
Yeah.
What if you're pregnant a week later or a month later?
Hopefully none of these girls will be pregnant a week or a month later.
So you've given them a little window here.
This is a good, like, birth control
No pregnancy
experience.
during this time period. Is there an incubation program? How long do you have to kind of keep it out?
I don't remember, but there's a bunch of different studies that have different things in it.
Should be okay.
Everyone should be fine. Yellow fever is actually more of the concern.
Yeah, you've taken shots for that.
I had it when I was a kid, so.
So I can't get...
When I went to northern Brazil, the pharmacist recommended a specific, mosquito repellent for Zika and stuff like that. So you get in touch with me, I'll let you know what that was.
Perfect.
But yeah, I kept them away while I was there.
I
wasn't pregnant either.
This introduction, obviously. We're in the fourth seal, which most people would say has something to do with pestilence. You know, working from Matthew 24, we have wars, famines, pestilence. Here it says plague in my version. There's a famous, parable about the disease that popped up in India, and everyone is getting sick, and people are dying, and no one can find a cure. You've heard these stories. Then it jumps to Pakistan and Afghanistan. All of a sudden, it's everywhere. And we've had little mini versions of that scares people. Here it is, Ebola or SARS or HIV. Is that what this fourth seal is about? Is that someday there's going to be a disease that we can't cure, that the Center for Disease Control cannot solve, and we're going to have a plague like they had, where what, a third of Europe died or whatever it was under that? Is that what we're looking at here? So we've had war and now death, and we've had famine, and now we're just going to have disease. And anybody who's ever been sick, I had one night in Bangladesh, I was as sick, if I had to be more than another day like that, life wouldn't be worth living. It was so miserable. And we all know people that have chronic pain. You work here in the hospital, it's got thousands of people sick like that. And people are just miserable. Is that what we're talking about here? And we're just going to have a time when our protections are gone, and we just don't have any barriers. Or something else. You've interpreted them spiritually most of the time. You have chosen between the physical and the spiritual. You've chosen, what is a spiritual application to pestilence and disease?
Well, I think if you wanted to put a different spin on the word pestilence, I think it would be deadly disease.
Okay.
Kind of a fatal disease, a disease that just takes you down to the end. And spiritually speaking, that would be the very, very last ends. A person who has rejected the gospel, a person who has stayed away from the Word of God, who's just gone their own way, eventually comes to the place where this disease comes upon you, sort of a spiritual diabetes or something that just takes over, and you end up in destruction. So it's a very, very desperate situation. It's not still close of probation, though. It's still hope. You know, death and Hades are following along, but it's showing a little bit before the end. Close of probation, I would understand, is in chapter 7, where you have the 4 angels holding the winds of strife. So the context for that here is showing how bad things can get within history. And then by the end of the seals, you come to the place where people make final decisions forever. People are settled with the gospel, or people are settled against it, and there's no more changing of the minds.
Is God using this to wake people up?
That's what I would see here with the fourth seal. We are still within history, we're still within normal life, and God is simply saying, look, you know, if you find yourself in this condition, if you are so far gone that you're about to die, that the last little spark, you know, remember in the last show I talked about, what if a person is divided and 20% of them is kind of on God's side and 80% is not? What if it dwindles down to 2%? That's the situation here, and God is saying, you know, the light is about to be extinguished. The life in you is about to expire. Move now or forever be stuck in this condition.
Most people are sick. You know you're sick. Will people have that experience where you just know, I am way off. This is no good. Or will people blissfully go to the end not realizing that they really are far away from God? Or will everyone say, I've made a wrong choice and I am miserable, and then they choose to go back to God?
I think you'll have people of all varieties.
All of that.
Certainly. There are some people who are far from God and revel in that. So I don't want to have anything to do with God. There are other people that are far from God. They know it and they regret it, but somehow can't come to making a serious decision.
Sarah, C.S. Lewis talks about God shouting to us through our pain, right? Is God doing this? Is God saying, if I can't wake you up any other way, I will send disease and make you wake up?
I don't know, I guess that challenges a little bit my character of God thing, because like I think I've always struggled with that, where people have often said that, you know, like if someone's dying or there's a sickness or something like that, like, well, it's God's will. Or like, I don't know, that always kind of rubbed me the wrong way, because I'm like, I don't really think that's God's will. Like, I don't think he's sitting there like, yes, you shall be in pain for all time. I think there are ways that God allows things to happen so that way something can come out of that. I think that that's more the storyline, and I still can't picture God saying,
Giving
like,
people cancer.
I think there's other ways to communicate with people, and yeah, I'm hard-headed, and sometimes it has to get really bad before I take a moment. But at the same time, I don't perceive God as the one that's like, you know what, Sarah hasn't been listening, so I'm going to try to make her life as miserable as possible so she needs me more.
You've had tough physical times.
Have
they brought you closer to God?
In some senses, I think, I think in some senses it's been time, because I can't do things that I normally would do. So the things that I would busy myself doing, I couldn't physically do. I was bedridden or something, and so I would have to sit there and I would have to think like, well, what else is going on in the world, you know? But I don't think that, I still don't perceive that as God saying, like, in order for Sarah to listen, I need to send all this stuff down to her to stop her in her tracks. And I think that messes with my, again, character of God. However, I think God can use those moments to say, like, okay, now you have time to reflect. What would you like to think about, you know?
I don't know if you were in church when we had Dr. Bolivar. Were you there?
Yeah.
Whipped off his cap, is bald because he's gotten chemo.
Yeah.
Here's a doctor, 62 years old, has been my doctor for 20 years, and he ends up with cancer 2 months ago. And it's just woken him up. He was a good guy before. He wasn't a pagan, but he wasn't on fire for God the way he is right now. He is reading the Bible. He is thinking, and his father was a pastor. He is on fire because of pain.
Yeah, but I think also you have two directions you can go with that. Some people would be in that situation and, yeah, suddenly have this passion, this desire to live so well now. Other people will have resentment and anger and think this is unjust. I've been a good person. I've donated money to mission trips and whatever else. Like, and they'll have another reaction. And I don't think, unless we believe in predestination or like a certain outcome, that God would allow that to happen, saying like, well, you better have this reaction. I don't think that's the case. But I think innately, when we're challenged with something that we never thought would happen to us, we almost always reassess our entire lives. Like pretty much everyone I know. And I think there's a big movement on dying well, which sounds really morbid, but like the act of dying well, and that involves how you live, yeah, just as much as how you die, but you can die well because you can react to that and like go through it in a beautiful way.
You went to Italy.
Yeah, to die.
I mean, you were told you had so many weeks to live, and
Right.
said, okay, because there was friends there, because you wanted to see the castles. I mean, what did you want to do?
Well, I just didn't want to die in a hospital bed. I didn't want to go out like that weird person that was like sickly and miserable. And so I had a friend who was going to school in Florence and had said like, hey, come out and visit. And then my college roommate was like, I'm bored. What do you want to do? And I was like, guys, I'm dying. I have a plan. And we all hopped on the plane and we spent a month and some driving through all of Italy and France. And it was beautiful because it was just like, I didn't want to resent the last month
Is that
of my
what
life.
kept you alive?
Nobody knows.
What if you hadn't gone? Maybe you'd have died.
It's possible.
You wouldn't be here.
But I think that's exactly it, though, is that like dying well. Like I had come to grips with, like, well, this was my life. I have a month, and when you get given a month, that's a pretty quick timetable, and you have to suddenly assess life and say, like, okay, so what do I want to die as? Do I want to die? And not everyone has that opportunity. Luckily, I was an idiot, and so I was fine with like the consequence of being found on the side of the road in Italy and having to ship my body somewhere. Like, I was weirdly okay with that. And like, in that process, though, I had to go through it, and I had to say, like, okay, what do I believe in? What are the staples of my life? How do I want to end it? What do I want to be remembered as? Who am I comfortable going through this journey with? You know, there's a lot of different things, and like in the end, that's just kind of how it worked out, and it was convenient, and it was fun and weird, and
We're glad you're
So
still here.
if God did that, would you resent it now?
no, actually. Only because I think for me, I always was that like slightly bulletproof, invincible like kid. Like I stabbed myself in the heart when I was like 3. You know, like I was an idiot child, and so I feel like I had
I
survived so
kind of
much.
remember those days.
Yeah. I wasn't an easy child to have, and I think for me, like finally facing my mortality, like so head on, like because there was nothing anyone could do. Like that opened up a lot for me, where it was like, this isn't God, this isn't anything, and it gave me an opportunity to reassess everything and say, okay, there it is, you know. And for me, I wasn't remotely like mad at God, not even a little bit. I was just like, well, everyone has their thing. Let's go with this, you know. And so I don't think for me it was even a God question.
I would agree with you that God does not normally make people sick in order to teach them a lesson and stuff. You know, we kind of have that perspective. I think sickness is part of the whole problem of sin. It's stuff we often bring upon ourselves, and even when we don't, it's the consequence of somebody else's sin or whatever. But I don't want to go to the extreme of saying God never does that, because I think of Balaam's donkey. You know, God does sometimes intervene to get our attention. And, you know, with Balaam's donkey, I mean, Balaam's leg got scraped up against the wall there because the angel was crowding the donkey over. And, you know, it's kind of a humorous story even to say it. But God will get our attention any way we can. But the messes we get ourselves in, he will use
That's right.
to get our attention
And that's
most of the time.
exactly it. It's like, yeah, maybe there's a cause and effect that move people in a direction, but I don't inherently believe that God's like, because I need to have a conversation with you, I'm going to destroy your entire life. Like, I don't think that's it. I think that he can see that opportunity and go in and be like, okay, well, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to mess. Like,
I think of the
Balaam's
school
donkey.
teacher that never raises their voice, you know, and everybody behaves. But one day the school's on fire and the kids are just distracted. That teacher will stand up on the desk and throw erasers and scream at them, not because she hates the kids, not because she wants them to be burned up, because she wants to save them. And I think sometimes in the Bible you see God raising his voice. Mount Sinai, for example.
Yeah.
He raises his voice, he thunders, the people are, and then he says, don't be afraid. This is not a fear thing. I just need you to be listening.
Oh, Jesus says that
Yeah.
in the New Testament constantly. I mean, he knocks over tables, he shakes people up a couple times. But I
Yeah.
think it's because people were misunderstanding what the actual message was and that there was something bigger going on than.
Let's face it, if God was against us, none of us would be here. It's just that
We haven't
simple.
read the passage yet. I was going to read that now that we've had this sort of introduction. And I'd like to hear a little bit about the 1/4. So watch for
Definitely,
that.
definitely.
So Revelation 6, starting with verse 7. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. So we've had what? We've had white, black, red, now pale. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over 1/4 of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. So if you interpret this historically as spiritually, we're talking about a time in the Middle Ages where people just began to go away from God and had no Bible, no Word of God, and began to spiritually die. Where's the 1/4? How do you take that?
Well, looking at it in the biblical context, first of all, I think that probably that force can be extended to all 4 horses. In other words, each of them has jurisdiction over 1/4 of the earth. Now, if you take the gospel approach, the one that I've been suggesting here, it suggests that there's 4 types of people in the world. You have those who respond positively to the gospel, those who reject the gospel, those whose rejection has led to the place where they've lost all contact with God's word and the gospel, and then finally those people that are at the point of spiritual death.
This is similar to the 4 soils in Matthew 13.
Right, exactly. So the analogy with Matthew, I think, is very helpful
So
here
is this
as well.
the last 1/4 of the world then? The other 3/4 have already been gone?
Well, it's looking at the condition of 4 different types of people in the world. What I think also supports the idea is when you get to chapter 7 and verse 1, he says, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth. Now you'll notice that in chapter 6 you have 4 living creatures related to 4 horses. Here you have 4 angels related to 4 winds. Those are parallel images. So each of these 4 seems related to 1/4 of the earth. Now what makes that interesting is when you get to the trumpets, everything happens with 1/3 of the earth.
Sure, yeah.
Now in the trumpets, it's clear that the focus is on the wicked. It's on those who oppose God, those who oppose God's people. So it talks about 1/3 of the earth there. That would be the 3 parts that have rejected the gospel, in my understanding. And when you get to chapter 16, Babylon has 3 parts. So the powers of evil are described in terms of 1/3 frequently through the book of Revelation. So that would suggest you have, in this section, you have God's people also in view. So the seals look at the whole human race. The trumpets focus on just the opponents of God and his people. So those little hints are pieces of evidence that lead me to look at the seals and the trumpets differently.
So to be real practical then, in the Middle Ages, a large portion of the world, roughly 1/4 spiritually die
Just
because they
really
rejected the word of God.
ultimately bad shape. Yeah. And perhaps that would particularly have focus in Europe, where Christianity was centered and yet had flown so far away. Now, you think of, many people think of Islam as a violent religion.
No.
If you go back in the Middle Ages, Christianity was even more violent. If you study the histories of the Crusades, you realize that Saladin, the Muslim commander, was actually the one constantly counseling mercy and things like that. And the Crusaders sometimes were killing the Christians in Jerusalem as well as the Muslims and the Jews. I mean, any Christian that looked a little bit different, they were dead too. So If you go back to the Middle Ages, Christianity does not come out very, very well. And I guess the question would be, if you got two religions and they're both violent, but one of them is violent in the name of the cross, which one causes God more grief? Wouldn't it be the one that knows the right way?
What a question.
And doesn't do it? The one that exhibits in his behavior the opposite of the cross, the opposite of self-sacrifice, the opposite of love for the brother and for the sister. One might argue that because Islam is not grounded in the cross, maybe you can say, all right, the violence, that's just sort of normal humanity. But Christianity, it's mind-boggling to realize that a religion that's grounded in the self-sacrifice of the Son of God could, in his name, paint crosses on their shields and go out there slaying old and young, Christian and non-Christian. It's stunning to think about.
Hard. Now, we've been a few weeks since I put my view out there. So there may be some viewers that haven't been with us for a while.
The disagreements.
So let me just review that, and then you answer that in this context. So my view has been, until I got to be with you here, that in Revelation 7, it says the angels are holding back the winds of strife. God says, if you eat of the tree, you will surely die. If you leave me and live your own life, you will eventually surely die. Satan says, you will not surely die. You can live a fine without me. And they've been able to do it for thousands of years. Now at the end of the world, God says, let me show you what life would look like without me. And begins to tell the angels to withdraw. But they do it in stages. And so in one stage are the 7 seals, and we have 1/4 of the world is damaged. And then the next stage is the trumpets, and 1/3. And then finally, under the 7 last plagues, God's not intervening at all. It's just evil full sway. Is the numbers, the increasing numbers of the 4, 1/4, 1/3, and then without mixture of grace, is there something in that sequence that tells us that at the end of the world there will be this withdrawal of God's intervening protection, and people will have to experience, the wicked will have to experience, and wake up and say, maybe I was wrong, and maybe I should think about this.
No, actually, I don't have any problem with that idea. You can take the image, as I said, 1/4, 1/3, full. There's many articles on that in scholarly literature. The idea that there's in German, a Steigerung, which means an acceleration, or I can't think of the best English word for that, but it's a crescendo. You know, kind of an increase, gradual in a certain direction. I don't think that contradicts this in the sense that in the seals you have a focus on all of humanity. In the trumpets you have a focus narrows to the wicked, but it's not terminal. You know, it's like there's thirds, it's only partial, it's a warning kind of a thing. When you get to the plagues, it's terminal, and you know, the whole race that has not accepted the gospel is in view. So I don't think those two concepts contradict each other.
So the expansion is still okay with that?
Oh yeah, no,
Okay,
the scholarship has talked about that frequently. It's one of the few things that are clear about the seals and the trumpets, is that there's some kind of I'm just not coming up with the right word, but it's like a staircase. Steigerung is like related to a staircase. But just
well, at least the Germans out there will know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I suppose. Okay. That's their prophetic surprise
go,
for
right?
today.
We've done the 4 horsemen to some degree. Why did God separate 4 horsemen and then 3 seals that are not horsemen? Why not 7 horsemen? Is there a distinction between the 4 and the other 3 as we wrap these 4 up? What do you want to say about that?
Well, actually, I would say that in these 7-fold visions, there tends to be the 4, the 2, and the 1.
Is it?
So you have the 4 horsemen, and then at the end of chapter 6, you have the 5th and 6th seals, and then there's
It's true.
nothing for a whole chapter, and then now comes the 7th. With the trumpets, you have the 4 that are all tied up with natural disasters, Then you have the 2 that seem to be demonic, and then it's chapter 10 and 11, and you're still looking for the 7th trumpet, and it finally appears at the end.
Yes.
With the plagues, you have the 4 that are tightly connected to nature again, but then you have Babylon, the Euphrates River and stuff. You're clearly talking about that historical thing. And then the 7th is the final one, you know, the earthquake to end all earthquakes. So the 4, the 2, and the 1, or the 4 and the 3 are definitely an organizing principle, I think.
Okay, okay, okay. Say something to lead us into number 5, just as we begin to wrap this show up.
Well,
we're going to have whatever you want to do to wrap it up.
Let me
I wanted to give a teaser for that.
Wrap up the 4 horsemen together, because you're looking at the basic pattern, as I understand it, the gospel, rejection of the gospel, famine for the word,
yes,
and then finally spiritual disaster, spiritual Ebola, you know, deadly disease. How do you read that? And I tend to read it in 2 ways. On the one hand, you can read it historically, as Seventh-day Adventists have tended to do through the years, and historically seeing this as a projection of history. You start with the 1st century, you start with the day of Pentecost, the enthronement of Jesus in heaven, and then the gospel goes out, opposition comes in, persecution, division, then you have compromise, the word of God is no longer guiding. Then you have this spiritual declension of the Middle Ages. And then as you get to the 5th seal, you now have language of judgment coming into play for the first time in the book. In the 6th, you see events preceding the second coming. So that there seems to be a historical progression. If that is the case, then it portrays pretty well the history of the gospel going out, persecution, decline, spiritual disaster, and then with the Reformation coming back, the gospel coming back with more strength once again, leading up to the end of time. So you can read it in that way. In the spiritual sense, wherever the gospel is preached, you can see these same stages. If you're an evangelist, you go different places around the world. You preach the gospel, some people receive it, their lives are transformed, other people reject it. Over time, they get more and more hardened against it until whole communities sometimes are deliberately opposed. So in a spiritual sense, it talks about the condition anywhere the gospel is preached. Maybe finally, looking at the 2 of you and at me, the ultimate implication is just for us personally. Where is the gospel encountering your life, Dan? Where's the gospel encountering your life now as you're heading down to Brazil? What is the call of the gospel to you? Mm-hmm. And if in your heart you're saying no, even 20%, even 50%, to that degree, the outcome is not going to be there that God has in mind.
Interesting.
Great summary. A sermon. I'm going to preach that sermon somewhere. Anyway, God bless you as you go to Brazil.
Thank
Pastor
you.
Sara, thank you, Jon, for the great wrap up to this. We'll come back to seal number 5.